And we are back on this Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and with Greece dominating the news, we thought we'd get some perspective from someone who's been following the situation closely. Mark Weisbrot is an economist. He is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He is also co-author with Dean Baker of the book Social Security, The Phony Crisis. He is a columnist for The Guardian and a number of other major publications, and is also president of the group Just Foreign Policy. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. Listen, I wanted to really get your sense of what the victory for Syriza, the left-leaning anti-austerity party, means first for Greece, then for Europe, and then perhaps even more broadly than that. You had some commentary. You said that this election is a great example for the rest of the Eurozone. Voters have rejected prolonged mass unemployment and elected a new government with a mandate to negotiate a better deal. Now, we're hearing a lot in the press about the pushback on that. What's the real story here? What do you think the mandate is for Syriza exactly, and how likely are they to get it?
Well, there's no doubt what the mandate is. I mean, Greece has had 6 years of recession, or you could call it a depression. They've lost a quarter of their national income. Unemployment is 26% and double that for youth unemployment. So they've suffered a lot, and most of that has been unnecessary, as most economists will tell you. Actually, that's not even that controversial. The austerity, the budget tightening, the spending cuts, and tax increases have shrunk the economy, and they've made the debt burden worse. And so this was wrong. And after 6 years, they finally got a government. And it's really the first one elected in the Eurozone that is serious, that not only has a mandate, but is serious, I think, about carrying it out to stop the kind of madness that they've had. So I think it's very significant because it could easily spread to other countries. You asked whether I think they're going to get something. I think they are. I think they have a lot of bargaining power. I think they're not going to threaten to leave the euro, and they don't have to. What they can do is just say, look, we're not going to do these things that you're demanding, and we're going to do some other things. And if you want to kick us out of the euro, well, they won't say that publicly either, but that's going to be the choice for the European authorities. And that includes the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and of course the IMF is also involved. And I think that they won't do it because they know, or at least the smarter ones know, that if they did kick Greece out of the euro, that there would be an initial crisis, but the most likely outcome would be that Greece would recover faster than the rest of the Eurozone, and then other countries would want to leave.
Well, let's talk about the assumptions or the knowledge base you're using to make those statements, which I think, and I want to use as a springboard a headline actually in The Guardian, but I saw many such headlines after the election. One of them said that a radical economist was taking over for Greece as the finance minister. But as I read his read of the situation, and for example, your read of the situation as an economist, it doesn't sound radical to me. It sounds like the kind of economic thinking that's been pretty much accepted since the days of John Maynard Keynes. Am I right about that?
Sure. I mean, look at the United States. This isn't a leftist government here, and hasn't been since the Great Recession. And in fact, Ben Bernanke was in charge of the Federal Reserve. He is Republican. But if you look at what happened in the United States, we had a year and a half of recession. It was a serious recession. And we're still not at the levels of employment that we should be, but it was 1 year and a half of recession. Excuse me. And Europe had about a similar length recession, and then they fell back into recession in 2011 and had at least 2 years and haven't really recovered. So why is that? It's because, we had more normal policies. We had a stimulus. We had quantitative easing beginning in 2008. The Federal Reserve, creating trillions of dollars and buying government bonds. The Eurozone had completely different policies. They were trying to, first they forced countries like Greece to cut back on their spending at a time when they were in recession. So, yeah, that's going to be a lot worse, and that's the result that you got. And it's because they don't have democracy there. They've handed over this decision-making power to unelected authorities, and it was a big mistake, I think.
So it basically then, if we accept, and I certainly do, the idea that there was a breakdown in democracy in terms of the transfer, certainly financial decision-making, to centralized organizations that are dominated, let's say, by larger countries than Greece or Spain, or more powerful, financially powerful ones, Germany being the lead, of course, then is it exaggeration to see the Syriza pushback, the election of Syriza, and the Greek people's position in that as a kind of confrontation between democracy at the national level and a lack of a democratization process at the multinational financial level?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, 20 governments have fallen since this crisis started, and they still didn't change policy. We wouldn't have that here, even if Mitt Romney had been elected. He would not have wanted to pursue anything like the kind of policies you saw in Europe because they would want to be reelected. He would want to be reelected. And so I think that this is the fundamental problem. It didn't look so bad when, the Eurozone was created and they had, 7 years of growth. Everything looked okay. You didn't see the kind of neoliberal or right-wing nature of the structure of the Eurozone. But as Warren Buffett used to say, it's only when the tide goes out that you see who's been swimming naked. And that's when, as soon as you hit a recession and the government had to do something constructive to help the economy recover, that's when the whole thing fell apart.
Well, and it's interesting, and Werner Herzog, by the way, used to say that characters in his movies, he studied them the way metallurgists studied metals. You put it under intense pressure to find out what it's made of, and it's a similar kind of thought. But we're talking with Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, about the situation in Greece. So the other thing that struck me about the Greek situation now, I haven't done this in a while, but when things first blew up there, I went back and I looked at some of the reviews of the Greek banking system and the Greek economy that were conducted by the IMF and conducted by the European Bank before things all went to hell. And they were pretty positive, actually. I mean, the ones I saw, anyway, it suggested to me that perhaps there had been a breakdown in oversight, and perhaps one of the problems in the European situation is that these international oversight agencies and organizations weren't stepping up and taking responsibility for what perhaps they might have missed. Am I off base there? Or
no, I think that's true. But I do think it's a secondary point. I mean, look at the United States. Talk about a breakdown of oversight. Mm-hmm. We had the biggest asset bubble. Actually, we had two of them. If you go back to the stock market one, but just in in terms of the immediate and proximate cause of the Great Recession here, it was a gigantic real estate bubble, the biggest asset bubble in the history of the United States. Where was the oversight and the regulatory authorities here? When they're handing out ninja mortgages and no income, no job mortgages, and selling these mortgage-backed securities that with the rating agencies giving them AAA ratings, turned out to be worthless. I mean, we had a horrible regulatory failure here that led to this terrible recession. But then the question is, what do you do when afterwards to clean up the mess? Do you clean it up or do you make it worse? And the European authorities chose to make it worse.
And I want to get into that. And I guess my point, with Mark Weisbrot, economist, I guess my point in making that observation about the evaluations that were done prior to the crisis leads more to accountability as one element in the process. Obviously, from an economic point of view, what do you do about it? That makes that a secondary point, because now you have a crisis. Now you have a fire burning. You have to put it out. But in terms of accountability for the fire, I think it's important to see what broke down, because this is getting framed in much the same way that relief for underwater homeowners was framed in this country. This is getting framed as a moral issue in which the Greek people are being described as complicit in their own fate, whereas the regulators and international agencies that gave the green light aren't being held responsible. In fact, they're the ones lecturing the Greeks on morality, and not to mention the international banking community or the financiers who are part of the whole Greek banking boom and so on. So I guess what I'm getting to is more of a moral point than a what do we do about the conflagration, which I do also want to get to. But I'm just speaking from a moral point of view. It feels to me that the European community, the IMF, the European Bank, not to mention the private sector banking community, all kind of got a free pass in this thing. And everybody's saying, well, the Greek people have to experience even more pain because it's their fault. Yeah,
well, I mean, that's ridiculous. First of all, from just the point of view of any kind of justice. I mean, in a capitalist system, if you don't do diligence and you make bad loans, you're supposed to take losses. You're not supposed to, have some supranational force come in and squeeze it out of the population of the affected country. And so that's not a good argument. But, it's even worse than that, because, what the European authorities did was even worse than try and squeeze them for debt. I mean, after all, they did get some debt relief, and the private creditors did take a haircut on the principal, but it wasn't enough. I mean, their debt, because they shrank the economy so much, the debt is still, it's 170% of GDP now, when it was only 115 back in May of 2010 when they signed their first IMF agreement. So the policies failed. The policies made the debt bigger, and the debt burden, less payable, in spite of the haircut, in spite of the restructuring. But there's something even worse going on that doesn't get the attention that it deserves in the media, although it's there if you really look for it. And that is that, the 2 years of financial crisis, which you had in 2011 and 2012, most of 2012, where, and part of 2010 even, where the future of the euro was really in doubt. And that really created a mess, because of all the uncertainty and fear that surrounded that. That was really prolonged by the European authorities in order to use it to force not only Greece but Spain and Portugal and Italy and Ireland, and they want the whole eurozone to make these changes that people don't want to vote for. That cuts in healthcare spending, which was 40% of public healthcare spending in Greece, cuts in pensions, cuts in the minimum wage. This was a real political program, and they were using the crisis and prolonging it in order. So,
Mark, we're going to have to go to a break in a second, but I want to continue this a very important line of discussion about this as a power confrontation and showdown and leveraging of a crisis. So I want to re-explore this with you when we come back. We're talking with Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, about the crisis in Greece. We will be right back. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and we are talking with Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, economist, columnist, and also president of Just Foreign Policy. Now, Mark, before we went to break, very interesting point. You were saying that the policies of the European community were actually exacerbated, the fiscal policies in particular, and the IMF, were actually exacerbating the crisis intentionally. Was that an intentional?
Well, it's not that they didn't. It's not a conspiracy theory. Like you had a crisis, so they didn't create it. But what they did was they didn't use their power to end it, which you could see. So for example, during these years, you had, markets were understandably nervous about the future of the euro. And so you had a lot of turbulence. You had Italian and Spanish bonds going up to 6-7% for 10-year bonds. They're now down, 1 point something. Now, why is that? Well, it's because the hedge funds, the other institutions and investors were betting that Italy and Spain, those are the two big to fail ones, and of course Greece too was much smaller. They were betting that they couldn't pay their debt. They weren't going to be able to pay their debt, and of course they couldn't if interest rates, their borrowing costs stayed that high. And so what we saw though, so the European authorities, the European Central Bank being the main one there, they just let this go on, for a couple of years, which was devastating. And then suddenly on July 12th of 2012, Mario Draghi, who was the head of the European Central Bank, just basically uttered two sentences. He said, we're going to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. And that was it. After that, they didn't have to put up a euro to back up the statement. All they needed to do was to say it and mean it, and that was the end of the financial crisis of Europe. The yields on the 10-year bonds for Italy and Spain, and of course others went with them, they just declined ever since then. And now they're at really low levels, in spite of the crisis that you see right now in Greece. And so they could have done that at any time, because the European Central Bank can print money just like the Fed. They can overwhelm any hedge fund or private investor that wants to be stupid enough to bet against them. And they didn't do it. And they didn't do it, and you can see this from a lot of the public statements that people made, that European officials made, and also from the thousands of pages of IMF consultations with these governments that took place between 2008 and the end of 2011. You can see that why they didn't do it. They had a political agenda, and they knew that if they pushed those yields down to sustainable levels by guaranteeing, which they eventually did,
that would weaken their hand in terms of forcing austerity on these countries, right?
That's right. So it's a terrible crime, really, and it's been under the radar for the most part. I mean, I think a lot of people know this. Like I said, it's not a secret. But nobody wants to talk about it.
Well, now we have a situation, and we're talking with the economist Mark Weisbrot. Now we have a situation where the Greek people have said enough. The new finance minister described their past treatment as repeated fiscal waterboarding, which I thought was graphic and very descriptive, very accurate. They've really, I mean, we don't even have time to go through the hell the Greek people have been through in the last few years as a result of these austerity policies and what came before. So now we have Greece, we have Podemos, the group in Spain that is very similar to Syriza in its platform. We have other countries in the Eurozone that might react the same way. And we have a show, in effect, what looks like a showdown where powerful finance ministers and others in Germany and other larger European countries are saying no more concessions. This is it. And if, it feels like brinksmanship. They're saying, well, they're going to find themselves outside the Eurozone, or there is, and yet they have a very powerful mandate at Syriza in Greece to hang tough. I'll be a little unfair here and ask, you have any crystal ball sense of where this might go?
Yeah, I think I can say the most likely outcome, although it's not guaranteed. I think most likely the European authorities will make enough concessions so that Syriza can declare victory, and you'll get some more progress in Greece than you would have otherwise had. And I don't think that's guaranteed, because you have crazy people in some of the institutions and the European authorities. But I don't think they're going to prevail, because I don't think they want to take the risk, even if
of dismantling the Eurozone.
Well, I think the big risk is that, and this is what I don't think it's been a major theme in the media, but I think the big risk for them is that Greece is forced out of the euro. I mean, Syriza is not going to propose ever leaving the euro, and they're not going to leave. They're going to, if anything, they'll, if their negotiations break down, they're going to have to be kicked out. And I don't think the European authorities have the guts to kick them out, because if they get kicked out, there's a very good chance, in fact, I would say the most likely outcome would be that they'd have an initial crisis like Argentina did back in 2001, at the end of 2001, beginning of 2002, and that crisis lasted only 3 months. And I think Greece would have something similar, actually maybe even not as bad, because Greece will have other sources of funding. And then they would recover faster than the rest of the Eurozone, and then others would want to leave.
Right. Then, so, and if Syriza does win some concessions, then might strengthen the hand of Podemos.
Well, that's their dilemma, and the hardliners are going to say that, to each other, to the other players on the other side, on the neoliberal right-wing side. That's going to be a theme. That's going to be a fear. And to tell you the truth, I have another fear, and that's the United States. Up till now, the United States has played probably a positive role in the Eurozone crisis, especially when Obama was running for re-election, for example. He didn't want them to just make a horrible mess out of Europe, because that would have potentially even hurt the U.S. economy. And so, they mostly defer. The U.S. has enormous control over the IMF. It's basically a U.S. Treasury-run organization, except in the case of Europe, they allow the Europeans to decide, what they're going to do. And the IMF directors, European directors, decide. But they did use a little bit of influence to say, that they didn't really like the idea of making a mess out of Europe. And now I fear that they could be on the side of the hardliners behind the scenes, because they have another thing that's more important to them than the international financial system, and that's foreign policy. And the Syriza government is a left government, and they're not going to have the same foreign policy as any previous government. And if you know the history, you know that the United States supported, fascism and dictatorship and a lot of mass murder to keep Greece from having a left government going all the way back to the end of World War II. And so that's going to be another factor. So that's why I can't say for sure that the Europeans are going to give in, because you don't know what the U.S. influence will do. But I imagine that there will be a compromise. I think that's the most likely solution.
And if there is a compromise, and Podemos, let's say, does well as a result, could it result in a more positive balance of power, for lack of a better term, between these international financial institutions and the individual democracies in the second tier of the Eurozone?
Yeah, it'll be, I mean, that's the strategy that Tsipras has outlined for quite a while. He said, look, exit is not really an option for various reasons. I mean, mostly political, which I can go into if you want. And he said, we're going to have to change the Eurozone. We're going to have to make it so that it's not this horrible neoliberal project that it was constructed to be, that it actually is more like a reasonable national government would be, that it supports growth and employment. And that would be, Podemos would be a big step towards that. I think it would start to influence the left in other countries, including France. Now,
one last question. It's a fascinating topic, and we're talking with Mark Weisbrot, economist, about the Greece situation. I guess one last question. It seems to me that with the exception of Bernie Sanders in this country, I haven't seen too many mainstream politicians or political groups express a positive reaction to the Syriza election. Is that because this is insignificant to the United States in their perception of it, which I think is small-minded, or they're afraid of running afoul of financial institutions or the orthodoxy of austerity thinking, or are they just not paying attention?
I don't think they're afraid of that, of the financial institutions or being against austerity. I mean, like I said, we couldn't have this kind of austerity here. It just wouldn't fly. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they're opposed. I think it's a combination of, foreign policy and national elections here is generally not a big issue. Europe isn't that big of an issue because, whatever happens there isn't going to really affect the U.S. that much. But I think also there's a deep prejudice against, a left party like Syriza. It's a left party. It's not allied with the United States, for example. I mean, it's not against the United States, but it's not allied with the United States. And so I think the politicians will be cautious. For example, they've already announced that they don't like the proposal of the European Union to put more sanctions against Russia. And that's something that they could actually block because the EU is making that decision by consensus. And so, if you're a politician here and you don't care much one way or the other about this, you're not going to endorse a party that may end up going against U.S. foreign policy on a number of issues. I'm not sure they will right away because, from their point of view and from Tsipras' point of view, the head of the party, in terms of electorally, it's probably easier and more convenient to use the foreign policy positions as a bargaining chip to get what they need more urgently, which is the debt relief.
That was my theory, too. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But thanks so much for joining us and explaining the background of this and giving us your thoughts on it. It's a really fascinating topic. We've been speaking with Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, my pleasure.
And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.